All right, so our next speaker, let me introduce Professor Murat Yucel. I first met Murat when I first arrived here in Melbourne in 1999, and I've been lucky enough to work with Murat ever since. Murat gained a PhD combined with specialist clinical training in clinical neuropsychology in 2001, and since then he's worked across numerous mental health research centres at both the University of Melbourne and now at Monash University, where he leads currently the Addiction Research Programme and is the director of the Brain and Mind Health Laboratory within the School of Psychological Sciences at Monash University. He's an NHMRC Principal Research Fellow and was recently named on the 2015 Thomson Reuters High Citation List, which is in the top 1% of the world's most influential scientific minds by citations during the last 11 years. Murat works at the interface between clinical neuropsychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, and technology. Please welcome Murat.
Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure working with you across nearly 2 decades, and it's a pleasure to be here presenting at the Turning Point Symposium. I hope you enjoy what I'm going to tell you about some of the work that we're doing in lovely Clayton. You should come and visit sometime. I'm just going to tell you more about the, not specific studies, but more the broad kind of things that we're up to that feed into this title. So more carrots that I'm dangling that you can ask questions about. So I'm going to start by saying that in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a number of wow moments in science. And let's just quickly go over them. One of them is how much we've learnt about the brain itself, particularly around the habit system of the brain. When something goes from being a choice, decision, to something that's much more automated without too much thinking, it just happens. And we've learnt a lot about this brain system. The work of people like Andy and others, particularly in the animal space, have told us a lot about how the system works. People say that up to 50% of our behaviours is driven by automatic behaviours. We get in the car, we just do it. We don't think about it unless an orange light comes up. Then we start to engage other processes. But most of the time, we're in an autopilot. And it's a very powerful system. It's an amazing system. Imagine you had to get in the car and learn how to drive a car every time. It wouldn't be a very efficient way to do things. So we need it. It's a blessing. But on the other hand, if certain experiences are reinforced too much, this system can lead to addictions and so on. But we've known a lot about this system. We've learnt that, another massive finding is that the brain is constantly changing, that every experience that we have, that we repeat, that's intense, is somehow probing the brain in certain directions and forming, unforming circuits. And this is, again, an amazing, on the one hand, it could be a blessing because we can always change and reinvent ourselves. On the other hand, if you're vulnerable to advertisements about gambling, if you're vulnerable to other things, if you've had abuse, the system can adapt in ways that's not so helpful. But it's an amazing, big picture thing that we've learnt over the past couple of decades. What this means is that everything we do affects our brain health to some degree. It's good to the degree that we can be in charge of what happens, and it's bad to the degree that if we're not careful, changes can happen upon us that lead to maladaptive outcomes. And finally, the technology revolution, it also means that a lot of what's happening around us, the multitasking, the way we engage with the world is probably having some influences here as well. And on the other hand, we've got things like non-invasive brain stimulation, where we can start to just prod and probe parts of these systems in a safe, non-invasive way. And that's another part of the technology revolution as well. So lots happened in the last 20, 30 years. Now, if we come to addiction, and this is the space that we work in, so we look at substance addictions, behavioural addictions, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, we see that current treatments actually only reach a relative minority of the population, maybe 20%. So it's obviously not accessible to the majority of the population. And even when they are accessing the treatments, there's often side effects, and the compliance is low and the relapse is high. Now, we can debate whether the treatments are are successful or not, but I think we'd all agree that there's a lot of room for improvement. So the current approaches have really failed to integrate a lot of this knowledge into treatment plans and treatment regimes. I guess we're all trying, but we're not there. There's a long way to go. Our vision is really to translate this neuroscience into practice by personalising these, trying to, from all of our learnings of neuroscience, develop more accessible interventions, to personalise it, and also to create more positive change, both at the clinical and as well as the public level. Just to expand on that a little bit more, we're aware of that this valley of death is getting a lot more attention lately because there has been all this knowledge generated, but it's not coming across. Why is that? So people are starting to really dig deep and look into what the causes of that might be. Is it just people just don't believe that neuroscience has something to contribute? Is it that studies are not designed in a way that is clinically relevant? They're just looking for short wins, not translatable longer-term wins. Maybe we're not looking at the right things. Maybe we're not giving clinicians the tools, the training, the technologies to make this happen. You can imagine a lot of our tests that we use are not very practical in a clinical setting. They're too time-consuming, they're not very engaging, they're costly, or is it a framework that we use? There's all these things that are being looked at. So we really think there does need to be a paradigm shift, and we want to be part of a paradigm shift in this space where we're pushing this neuroscience knowledge combi into directions which make a clinical impact. And we've got to figure out ways of how do we grease the wheels, get a new combi, but get that thing across to make bigger impact. And we're fortunate to have the supports to try and do that over the next 5-6 years. So what are we doing about it? In terms of our framework, what we've adopted, the traditional framework is the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which is a very good manual for communicating clinical information from one clinician to another based on disability, distress, behaviour, subjective reports. A lot of important bits and pieces of information can be communicated very efficiently using this system, but it's not it's not based in driving research. It's a categorical communication system that doesn't directly link to the brain. And it splits these things up often. It kind of categorises them. We're adopting something like, you might be familiar with the RDoC, the NIH, where it's a research domains criteria, which is much more a dimensional approach to research, where you look at shared vulnerabilities and dimensions that cut across these behaviours. So you might think of something like impulsivity. In this system, impulsivity cuts across 20 diagnostic categories, different sections of DSM. In this system, it's the dimension, and you look on that spectrum of how all of these things fit on that spectrum. So it's a very different way, and therefore it lends itself much more to a research and the latest findings in neuroscience. So we're adopting this kind of system, and we're looking at all of these disorders in a transdiagnostic way as a way of saying, what are the shared vulnerabilities, and does that tell us something useful and insightful that might be of clinical relevance? In terms of assessment, what we're doing is, so we've taken that framework, and what they've said is, here's 40 interesting dimensions that you should explore in the psychiatry space. But this doesn't tell us how we should apply that to addiction. It's a very broad framework. There's no specifics in there. So what we're doing is we're taking that, and we've got 37 experts from around the world who are clinicians and researchers who get those spaces across to tell us how we would use the 40 or so dimensions that this framework gives us, which ones are most really essential for addiction. And we've done that over the past 12 months. These 37 experts have 3 comprehensive assessments where they've given us lots of feedback, and we've actually retained 36 of them across the 12 months. And what we're doing now is this group of people with Leo Fontanelli, who's our psychiatrist on board, who's really driving this online assessment tool. we're taking the world expert kind of consensus about what are the most relevant dimensions, and we're developing an online tool that's going to not only look at cognition, but subjective experience, the also a clinical impression of what's going on, and try and pull it together in a very accessible way, cheap way, practical way for clinicians, and really targeted at addiction, underpinned by the latest neuroscience and expert consensus. So we hope to do that in the next 12 months, to have something available that we can give clinicians and researchers to be able to use. We're also linking with industry partners who have an infrastructure that allows that to happen, and also a company who designs games to make it engaging, make sure it is something that people will be highly motivated to do, and not just think, oh, you know, not another test. So that's one thing that we're doing. If we can do that, then the idea of that is that it would be able to, the end result of that is we can have candidate phenotypes. Rather than having addictions, we have these phenotypes that really drive behaviour. What's the motivational triggers of those behaviours? And we can then triage those people into particular treatments that work on those phenotypes. So that would be the idea, kind of a treatment tailoring idea. But we don't want to stop there. We want to actually have treatments that then actually target those phenotypes. We know in terms of lifestyle interventions, exercise has come up as being this amazing thing that creates huge change. I mean, one of the big things we've learned is neurogenesis is possible, so the birth of new cells. And so these red dots that you see here is a staining technique that shows the birth of new cells in the hippocampal region. And studies, both many in animals and some in humans, now show that this is a pretty real thing. There's good evidence, overwhelming evidence that this is possible, and you can change your brain with exercise. Whether the number of minutes of exercise per week is linked to this hippocampal region volume increase. My collaborators have shown that as well in terms of hippocampal volume increase by fitness, a change over time, and we know that exercise has all of these, not just neurogenesis and growth, but many other beneficial effects as well. It sets a framework for interventions to be maximally effective. So we know that all of this is very similar. Studies showing mindfulness can do similar things as well. So last year, Lauren ran a study where she did in our own group, she did a 12-week intervention, aerobic exercise, and showed that you can get 3 to 4% hippocampal change, a 16% change in a metabolite in the brain that's a good thing to increase, called NAA, and a 6% improvement in memory over a 12-week physical exercise intervention, which is a nice validation. And now Rebecca's kind of taking this forward with a team and some industry and partners, where she's combining exercise with mindfulness and exercise with brain stimulation to see if the combinations can synergistically change the brain in ways that we want to and target the phenotypes that we think are relevant to addiction. And we've recently published a bit of a publication that shows some of the possible applications of this kind of approach. The other thing we're doing is, in terms of virtual reality, there's been a huge investment, and it's big companies are putting big money into it. It's going to be everywhere. You're going to get it with your TV in 5 years' time. So we're trying to be a bit ahead of the game and developing virtual reality techniques for intervention and research. So what this study shows is that VR has a bit of a rich history in PTSD for exposure therapy. And this study looked at OCD and showed that if you get people to do 4 actions, action 1, 2, 3, and 4, with graded levels of exposure, so it's getting more and more fearful and anxiety-provoking, that VR is actually pretty good for this. You can do that in a virtual. Even though it's not real, you can expose people to things that seem real. And if you look at their engagement and satisfaction with the experience of VR, it's very high. They quite enjoy doing it in that kind of, it feels real, it's all good. And in this study, they exposed people to a dirty bathroom and found that this is 3 individuals. If you give them CBT and follow what happens to compulsive behaviour, there wasn't much of a change. Then you give them this period of familiarisation with virtual reality, not exposing, just getting familiar. Then you do your exposure paradigm. You can see it started to drop things, or in this person who was constantly compulsive and nothing could shake it, exposure in VR actually started to move things around, so showing some promise. It's been shown in gambling as well, CBT versus exposure therapy. This is not VR, this is just exposure therapy, that it's useful and leads to long-term better outcomes. So this is the kind of the exposure that was applied in this. A lot of imagery, imagine this, imagine that. Then you actually take the person to the casino and do things. Now imagine in VR you could do this imagery in a much more real, physiologically, you're much more immersed in there. So potentially you can enhance this effect. And in terms of the in vivo, it's very costly, expensive, probably unethical, unscientific to take someone to a casino, whereas you could have them sitting in a casino and recording scientific data as you're doing it in your office. So lots of potential. We've developed a virtual casino. That's actually a screen grab from the casino, a OCD exposure paradigm as well, and to test some of these ideas. You can not only do exposure, but in this study, what they showed is that if you in this virtual environment, you start outside the gambling venue, go to the bar, and as you get closer and closer to the object of desire, that the urge to gamble is just as real as, or very close to real and comparable to what would be in reality. So now, if you can get someone there, you can actually start to test their decision-making in context while they're in that urge to gamble kind of moment, which is really important when you're looking at decision-making, not just cross-sectionally, but in that moment. It's the gambler's zone that you want to test people in. So we know that there's a really interesting effect called the near miss. When you get, near the pay line, this almost got there, but it didn't. Objectively, you didn't win anything. But subjectively, your brain gives a little squirt of dopamine, your physiology reacts. It's like a tiny win that keeps you there and keeps you going. And it's like you gained a bit of skill. You're almost there. Keep going. You're going to win the jackpot. Imagine doing that, and these are screen grabs again from our VR casino, in this environment where you're actually, it feels like you're really there. You build up that signal. Maybe this can be much more a greater signal where you can start to look at it at an individual level. But not only that, but you're getting all this data that you can work with in a therapeutic as well as an assessment kind of approach. So our goal is to combine things like immersion in VR with things like mindfulness in real time, exposure plus kind of intervention, the clinician or the researcher right there with you, working with you to collect data and intervene. And this has been shown in gambling. Mindfulness on its own has been shown to be very effective for gambling. Symptoms, urges, outcomes, and that's not even, that's on its own. If you did it in the real kind of, as it's happening, if you applied your skills, you may enhance those effects even more. We're also looking at combining multiple things like exercise again in this framework. If we can combine a more plastic brain with these, maybe we can get people recovering even quicker or more effectively. And I've shown you that already. And we might be able to combine it with TMS, so where we target these phenotypes that we started with at the beginning as well. And that's also been shown to be effective on its own. Maybe in combination we can accelerate the effects. And finally, going even broader, Adrian's running a number of studies where he looks at the ethical and policy implications of all this work. Everything from emerging technologies through to models of addiction and to stakeholder engagement. You can see some of the initiatives that, publications and initiatives that he's a part of. And one of them in particular is a big discussion about whether the disease model of addiction, which Mark is going to talk about as well, is a good or bad thing. And there's a public debate tomorrow, some of you might know about, specifically on that topic that Adrian's driving as a part of all of this. So it's also being careful about the language that we use and how we get that information out there to the public and to clinicians. The other thing that Adrian will be doing is using VR to look at things like policy or gambling cues that, advertisements that are supposed to help you. We don't know if they actually help you, but this is a screen grab of the VR. Maybe if we put these here and then measured their behaviour, we could actually empirically test whether it's having any effect on their behaviour. This is something that came out recently, that there was these pokey leaks, that the industry is now giving, Nick Xenophon information about the addictive properties of gambling agents like this. We've known that, but we can look at that within the VR specifically. We can strip away its elements and start to work out how that it is in fact addictive with empirical basis. I'm almost finished. So I guess, we're looking to innovate in a number of areas in terms of our approach, in terms of our tools that we're developing for assessment, the personalisation or the sub-personalisation of the kind of treatment approaches, and then the kind of actual interventions that we want to develop. And hopefully these target this, which are based on this, so like an integrated, more cohesive program of research that will hopefully push the research into clinical spheres in ways that hasn't necessarily happened before. So I'd just like to thank all the supporters and a fantastic group, the Brain and Mental Health Lab, that helped achieve all of this, and in particular the leadership group who's really driving a lot of this work together. So thank you.
That's great. So, questions? All exciting. Normally you see all this stuff for other really rich disorders where they get lots of investment. So to see it being applied in our field is very exciting. So questions? Don't be shy. Question over there.
I've been interested in VR exposure therapy for a while. I was just wondering how get involved in it or follow the research.
Yeah, it's quite a new field. There's some cognitive personality testing, exposure therapies that are developing. I think, in what sense do you want to follow it? Just read about it or get involved in it?
I guess read about it for a start.
Yeah. Yeah, look, there's a number of publications. If you look up PubMed, there's already some publications that are coming out in different domains. But I think every month you look at it, you'll see that there's going to be bigger and bigger things. But there's not a comprehensive list of stuff just yet. If there's something specific you're looking after, maybe write to me and I'll try to see if I know of anything.
Any other question? Just while people are thinking, I think, as you said, Murat, exposure therapy, we know that has a very strong evidence base in our field. And even we go back to sort of, a decade or more ago, there was a lot of excitement around looking at how we address the issue of cue-induced relapse. And we were lots of sort of exposure studies around sort of how do we train people to get used to cues. And the whole problem with that was that people were showing people paraphernalia in offices. And the evidence showed that in those studies, you could expose people in the offices to that paraphernalia and they would feel great. But the problem is when they went out in the real world, it didn't translate. So I think one of the exciting things is we've got a very strong literature about the importance of sort of dealing, working this way in terms of exposure treatment, but we don't actually have, as Murat says, because of ethics, it's very difficult to go into sort of Collingwood and find dirty streets and approach somebody who's dealing and sort of coach somebody through not, dealing with that. So this technology is very, very exciting in terms of sort of new frontiers and seeing what the possibilities are. Any final questions?
I came across some research, I think it was done last year, around exercise neurogenesis and the death of neurons about 2 weeks after, unless it was paired with mindfulness. And you sort of touch base a little bit around that. I'm wondering whether it was in that context and how you can relate that to urges or management of addiction.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Because exercise on its own doesn't necessarily, it leads to some growth We don't know the exact mechanisms. It could be neurogenesis, it could be just plasticity or growth of vessels, blood vessels. But if it is the growth of new cells, what you want to do is not just potentiate them, but then consolidate them. You want to use them in a way that they start connecting with other things so that they stay, and not just like a muscle waste away again. So you've created the potential, then you haven't consolidated it, versus you create the kind of potential, then you start connecting them so they start kind of being more enduringly there. So how do you do that? You set the kind of exercise sets the framework, and either mindfulness or TMS, you start to kind of fire so that they wire together to consolidate that network. And if you can target that, you might be able to target craving or control or so on. So that would be the idea.
Just to follow up, is it only in the hippocampus that we see the neurogenesis, or are there other areas of the brain?
No, there's about 3 main areas. The hippocampus is one of them. But I wouldn't focus necessarily specifically on neurogenesis. That's one thing. Plasticity, I think, is in some ways a more interesting phenomena, that you can make things more malleable across the whole brain.
So in the interest of time, we have to move on, but please thank Murat again, fantastic presentation.